The phone call came at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon that started like any other day, but ended with me staring into the abyss of American healthcare, watching my 12-year-old sister's life become a line item in a hospital's profit and loss calculation. The voice on the other end was professional, apologetic, and absolutely final. Maya's surgery, scheduled for Friday morning, was being canceled because our family couldn't provide the $23,000 upfront payment that the hospital required for elective procedures. Elective. They called a surgery to repair my sister's congenital heart defect elective, as if choosing to live versus choosing to die was really a choice for a 12-year-old girl whose heart was slowly failing, whose lips turned blue when she climbed stairs, whose future was measured in months rather than years without the surgical intervention that could give her a normal lifespan. "Mr. Johnson," the billing coordinator said, her voice carrying the practiced sympathy of someone who delivered financial death sentences multiple times per day. "We understand this is difficult for your family, but hospital policy requires payment guarantees for non-emergency procedures. We'd be happy to reschedule once you've secured the necessary funds." Secured the necessary funds. Like $23,000 was something our family could find in the couch cushions. Like medical financing was a simple matter of asking nicely at the bank. Like watching a child die from treatable conditions was acceptable as long as the proper paperwork had been filed and the correct payment schedules had been established. I hung up the phone and sat in our small living room, surrounded by get-well cards from Maya's classmates and medical bills that had accumulated faster than our family's ability to pay them, calculating how many miracles we would need in the next 72 hours to save my sister's life. 72 hours to find $23,000 we didn't have, or watch my little sister die because her life wasn't worth enough to the hospital's billing department. That's when I realized that shocking everyone, including myself, might be the only option left. My name is Marcus Johnson, and my sister Maya was the strongest person I had ever known, even though she weighed only 73 pounds and couldn't run more than 50 yards without stopping to catch her breath. She had been born with a complex congenital heart defect called tetralogy of Fallot, a condition that affects approximately 1 in every 2,500 children and requires surgical repair to prevent heart failure, stroke, and early death. For 12 years, Maya had lived with a heart that worked harder than it should have to pump blood through chambers and vessels that hadn't formed correctly during fetal development. She had undergone 3 previous surgeries as a baby and toddler, procedures that had bought her time and improved her quality of life, but hadn't completely corrected the underlying structural problems. Now, as she approached her 13th birthday, her cardiologist had determined that she needed a complete surgical repair, a complex procedure involving open heart surgery, artificial valve replacement, and reconstruction of the blood vessels that carried oxygen between her heart and lungs. It was major surgery, requiring a team of specialists and several days in the cardiac intensive care unit. But it would give her the chance to live a normal life, to run and play and grow up without the constant threat of cardiac arrest. The surgery was scheduled at Children's Hospital, performed by Dr. Sarah Chen, one of the top pediatric cardiac surgeons in the region. Chen had explained the procedure to our family with the kind of confidence that comes from successfully completing hundreds of similar operations, reassuring us that while the surgery was complex, Maya was an excellent candidate for complete repair. With this surgery, Dr. Chen had told us during our consultation, Maya can expect to live a completely normal life. She'll be able to participate in sports, attend college, have children of her own someday. Without it, her heart will continue to deteriorate, and she'll face increasing limitations and health complications that could become life-threatening. But Dr. Chen's surgical expertise couldn't overcome the financial barriers that stood between Maya and the operating room. Our insurance company had classified the surgery as elective because Maya wasn't currently in acute heart failure, despite the fact that delaying the procedure increased her risk of sudden cardiac death and permanent heart damage. I was 18 years old, 6 months out of high school, working 2 part-time jobs while trying to save money for community college. I had been Maya's protector since she was born, the big brother who carried her when she got too tired to walk, who helped her with homework when hospital stays made her miss school, who had learned to recognize the signs of cardiac distress and knew when to call for emergency medical assistance. Maya never complained about her condition, never seemed bitter about the limitations it placed on her activities. never expressed anger about the multiple surgeries and endless medical appointments that had defined her childhood. She approached every challenge with optimism and humor, making jokes about her special heart and talking excitedly about all the things she would do after her surgery was complete. "Marcus," she had told me the week before the surgery was supposed to happen, "after Dr. Chen fixes my heart, I'm going to try out for the soccer team. I've been watching videos online, learning about different positions and strategies. I think I'd be good at midfielder because I'm small and fast." The idea that Maya might never get the chance to try out for any soccer team, that her dreams of normal childhood activities might be limited by our family's inability to navigate healthcare financing, felt like a failure that went beyond financial constraints into fundamental questions about what kind of society allows children to die from treatable conditions. Have you ever received a phone call that turned your sister's life into a financial transaction? When you realize that in America, even children's lives have price tags that are calculated based on market forces rather than human value? When you understood that all the love and determination in the world couldn't overcome the simple mathematics of healthcare costs that exceeded your family's lifetime earning potential? That's where I found myself at 18, holding a phone that had just delivered a death sentence disguised as a billing policy, surrounded by a family that was about to learn the difference between medical miracles and financial realities. Maya's medical condition was as precisely understood as it was expensively treatable. Tetralogy of Fallot involves 4 distinct heart defects that occur together: a hole between the heart's 2 main pumping chambers, narrowing of the pulmonary valve that controls blood flow to the lungs, thickening of the right ventricular wall, and displacement of the aorta that allows oxygen-poor blood to flow directly to the body. The combination of these defects meant that Maya's blood wasn't getting properly oxygenated, causing the blue coloration around her lips and fingernails that became more pronounced when she was active or stressed. Her heart was working overtime to compensate for the structural problems, but the extra effort was causing the muscle to thicken and weaken in ways that would eventually lead to heart failure. The surgical repair required stopping Maya's heart completely while a heart-lung machine maintained her circulation, then carefully reconstructing the defective structures using patches to close holes, artificial valves to replace damaged ones, and precise techniques to redirect blood flow through the proper channels. Dr. Chen had estimated that the surgery would take between 6 and 8 hours, followed by several days in the cardiac intensive care unit and approximately 2 weeks of total hospital stay. The success rate for this type of repair was over 95% when performed by experienced surgeons on appropriate candidates, but the complexity of the procedure required a specialized team and equipment that made it one of the most expensive operations in pediatric medicine. The total cost for Maya's surgery, including surgeon fees, anesthesia, operating room time, intensive care, and hospital stay, was estimated at $127,000. Our insurance company had agreed to cover approximately $104,000 of that cost, but they required the hospital to collect the remaining $23,000 as a patient responsibility payment before the surgery could be performed. $23,000 represented more money than our family had ever had available at one time. It was almost exactly equal to our father's annual income from his job at the warehouse where he worked loading trucks. It was more than twice what our mother earned in her part-time position as a school cafeteria worker. It was a sum that might as well have been $23 million for all the realistic possibility we had of generating it through normal financial channels. The doctors had the skill to save her, but the system had decided her life wasn't worth the investment. The systemic failures that had led to Maya's surgery being canceled weren't accidental. They were the predictable result of policies that treated healthcare as a business rather than a human right, that prioritized hospital profit margins over patient outcomes, that created insurance systems designed to limit coverage rather than ensure access to necessary medical care. Our insurance company, which collected monthly premiums that consumed nearly 15% of our family's income, had spent months finding reasons to deny or delay coverage for Maya's surgery. They had required multiple consultations with their own cardiac specialists, demanded additional testing to confirm the diagnosis that had been obvious for years, and ultimately classified the surgery as elective because Maya wasn't currently dying from acute heart failure. The elective classification allowed the insurance company to impose additional restrictions and higher out-of-pocket costs, despite the fact that delaying the surgery increased Maya's risk of sudden death and made future surgical repair more complicated and dangerous. The medical necessity was clear to every doctor who examined Maya, but insurance policies were written by actuaries and accountants rather than physicians. The hospital's requirement for upfront payment was supposedly designed to ensure that they would be compensated for their services, but it created barriers that excluded families who needed care most. Patients with good insurance and financial resources could schedule surgeries with minimal delays, while patients like Maya faced cancellations and delays that turned treatable conditions into medical emergencies. Children's Hospital was a nonprofit institution that received significant tax benefits and community support based on their mission to provide healthcare to all children regardless of their family's ability to pay. But their billing policies contradicted that mission, creating financial barriers that were just as effective as turning sick children away at the emergency room door. The patient assistance programs that were supposed to help families in situations like ours required months of paperwork, financial documentation, and approval processes that couldn't be completed in the 72 hours we had before Maya's surgery would be permanently canceled and her condition would continue to deteriorate. Government assistance programs existed in theory, but they were designed for families whose incomes were below poverty thresholds that didn't account for medical expenses, and the application processes took weeks or months to complete. Emergency Medicaid might cover the cost of Maya's surgery if she was actively dying, but it wouldn't pay for preventive surgery that could keep her from reaching that crisis point. The cruel mathematics of healthcare financing meant that Maya's surgery would eventually be performed in an emergency room under crisis conditions at 5 times the current cost, but only after her condition had deteriorated to the point where delays could be fatal and surgical outcomes were less certain. But mathematics and policies and institutional failures were abstractions when I was looking at Maya's medical charts and calculating how many weeks or months she might survive without the surgery that could give her decades of normal life. I had found a way to get the money, but the cost would be everything I thought I knew about right and wrong. The breakdown of our family's capacity to handle Maya's medical crisis had been gradual, then sudden. For months, our parents had been exploring every possible avenue for securing the money needed for her surgery, applying for medical loans that they didn't qualify for, researching crowdfunding platforms that generated minimal donations, and contacting every relative who might be able to provide financial assistance. Dad had worked overtime whenever it was available, picking up extra shifts and weekend work that exhausted him, but barely made a dent in the amount we needed to raise. Mom had taken on additional hours at the school cafeteria and was considering a second job cleaning offices in the evenings, but even doubling her income wouldn't generate anywhere near the money required. Our extended family had contributed what they could, a few $100s here and there from aunts and uncles who were facing their own financial challenges, a small loan from my grandmother who was living on Social Security, modest donations from our church congregation that were generous in spirit but insufficient in amount. The fundraising efforts in our community had been touching but inadequate. Maya's classmates had organized bake sales and car washes that raised awareness but generated only a few $1,000s. Local businesses had donated gift certificates for silent auctions that brought in additional small amounts, but nothing that approached the scale of what we needed. By the time we received the phone call canceling Maya's surgery, our family had exhausted every conventional avenue for raising money and had managed to accumulate approximately $4,800, enough to demonstrate our commitment to Maya's care, but nowhere near enough to satisfy the hospital's payment requirements. The conversation with our parents that evening was unlike any conversation our family had ever had. For the first time in my 18 years, I watched my father cry. Not the tears of sadness or frustration, but the broken sobs of a man who had spent months fighting for his daughter's life and had finally been forced to accept defeat. "There's nothing more we can do," Dad said, sitting at our kitchen table with medical bills spread out like evidence of our family's failure. "We've tried everything, called everyone, applied for every program that exists. We can't get the money they want." Mom held Maya in her lap, both of them crying quietly as the reality of the situation settled over our family like a weight that none of us knew how to carry. "What does this mean?" Maya asked, her voice small and scared in a way that I had never heard before. "Does this mean I'm going to die?" The question hung in the air like a physical presence, and I realized that everyone was looking at me for an answer that none of the adults in our family seemed able to provide. When everyone else had given up, I realized I wasn't just her brother anymore. I was her only chance. That night, I lay in bed calculating impossible mathematics and researching solutions that ranged from desperate to illegal. I had considered every legitimate option I could imagine, taking out loans that I wouldn't qualify for, applying for grants that wouldn't be processed in time, starting a GoFundMe campaign that might raise money over months but couldn't generate $23,000 in 3 days. The illegal options I researched felt like betraying everything my family had taught me about character and integrity, but they also seemed more realistic than legitimate methods that had already failed. Bank robbery was obviously impossible for someone with no criminal experience and no access to weapons. Drug dealing might generate substantial income over time, but couldn't produce the immediate lump sum we needed. Theft would require finding someone who had $23,000 in cash and was careless enough to have it stolen. But the more I researched criminal options, the more I realized that illegal solutions would likely end with me in prison and Maya still needing surgery that our family couldn't afford. Getting arrested would eliminate my ability to help her, while creating additional problems that would make our situation worse rather than better. That's when I started thinking about legal options that were so unconventional, so unlikely to succeed, that they seemed almost as unrealistic as criminal alternatives. What if I could convince someone to invest in Maya's future, to provide the money for her surgery in exchange for some kind of long-term return? The idea that began forming was ambitious to the point of seeming delusional. Offer my entire future earning potential as collateral for a loan that would cover Maya's surgery, essentially selling myself into indentured servitude to someone willing to bet on my ability to eventually repay an investment in my sister's life. I had exhausted every legitimate option, which meant it was time to try the illegitimate ones. But as I researched the logistics of this approach, I realized that what I was actually considering wasn't illegitimate. It was just unprecedented. I was proposing to create a financial instrument that didn't exist in conventional markets, to find an investor who would take a bet on human potential rather than traditional collateral. The plan that emerged was radical but legal. Identify successful business owners or investors who might be willing to provide immediate funding for Maya's surgery in exchange for a percentage of my future income over a specified period. It would be like a personal loan secured by my entire career rather than by property or assets I didn't own. The challenge was finding someone willing to make such an unusual investment, convincing them that an 18-year-old with no college education and no established earning potential was worth betting on, and negotiating terms that would provide Maya with immediate life-saving surgery while giving the investor reasonable assurance of eventual return. But the most challenging aspect was the timeline. I had 72 hours to identify potential investors, develop a compelling presentation, negotiate terms, and secure the funding that would keep Maya's surgery from being permanently canceled. Instead of breaking the law, I decided to break every assumption about what an 18-year-old could accomplish in 72 hours. The next 3 days became the most intense educational experience of my life, as I learned to think like an entrepreneur, negotiate like a businessman, and present myself as an investment opportunity rather than a desperate teenager begging for charity. I researched successful local business owners, studied their backgrounds and business philosophies, and developed a presentation that positioned Maya's surgery as a long-term investment in human potential. The proposal I developed was straightforward. An investor would provide $25,000 immediately to cover Maya's surgery and associated expenses. In return, I would commit to paying 20% of my gross income for the following 10 years, regardless of what career path I pursued or how much money I eventually earned. The terms were heavily weighted in favor of the investor. If I became successful, they would eventually receive far more than their initial investment. But the terms also reflected the reality that I was asking someone to take an enormous risk on an unproven 18-year-old whose only collateral was determination and the promise of future productivity. I identified 12 local business owners who had reputations for community involvement and unconventional thinking, researched their backgrounds and business interests, and developed customized presentations that explained why investing in Maya's surgery would be both a humanitarian gesture and a potentially profitable business decision. The first 8 presentations were rejections. Business owners who listened politely to my proposal, but ultimately decided that the risk was too high, the timeline too short, or the precedent too unusual for them to feel comfortable making such an investment. but each rejection taught me something about refining my approach, addressing concerns more effectively, and presenting myself as a serious business proposition rather than a charity case. I learned to emphasize the potential returns rather than focusing on Maya's medical needs, to discuss my long-term career plans and income projections rather than our family's current financial struggles. The breakthrough came on Thursday evening, less than 18 hours before Maya's surgery would be permanently canceled, when I met with Patricia Rodriguez, who owned a regional chain of restaurants and had a reputation for making unconventional investments in young entrepreneurs. "Marcus," she said, after listening to my entire presentation, "what you're proposing is essentially a human capital investment, betting on your future productivity and character rather than traditional financial metrics. It's unusual, but it's not unprecedented in other industries." She asked detailed questions about my career plans, my educational goals, my understanding of the financial commitment I was making. She wanted to understand not just whether I could eventually repay her investment, but whether I had the maturity and determination to honor a 10-year commitment that would significantly impact my financial future. "The most important question," she said finally, "is whether you understand that this isn't charity. If I invest in your future, I expect you to build a future that's worth investing in. Are you prepared to work harder and achieve more than you ever thought possible?" With 4 hours left before surgery was permanently canceled, I finally convinced someone to believe in the impossible. The contract we negotiated that night was unlike anything either of us had seen before, but it accomplished exactly what we needed: immediate funding for Maya's surgery in exchange for a long-term commitment that would motivate me to build the kind of successful career that would make the investment profitable for both of us. Patricia's investment wasn't just financial, it was a vote of confidence in my potential that came at exactly the moment when I needed someone to believe that an 18-year-old could solve problems that had defeated every adult in my family. Her willingness to bet on my future gave me the resources to save Maya's life and the motivation to spend the next decade proving that her faith in me was justified. The phone call to the hospital at 6 a.m. Friday morning, informing them that we had secured the necessary funding and Maya's surgery should proceed as scheduled, felt like the most powerful moment of my 18 years. Not because of the money itself, but because of what earning it had proved about the possibility of creating solutions when conventional approaches had failed. When I told Maya that her surgery was back on schedule, she looked at me like I had performed magic rather than negotiation. "How did you do it?" she asked. "I convinced someone to bet on our family's future," I said. "Now we have to make sure that bet pays off." The surgery itself was even more successful than Dr. Chen had predicted. Maya's heart was completely repaired, her blood oxygen levels returned to normal ranges, and her recovery progressed ahead of the typical timeline for patients undergoing similar procedures. But the most meaningful transformation wasn't medical. It was watching Maya discover what it felt like to have a heart that worked properly, to run without getting tired, to participate in activities that had been impossible throughout her childhood. I had shocked everyone, including myself, by proving that love could move financial mountains. What would you do to save your sister's life? When does the healthcare system's cruelty become your call to revolutionary action? Have you ever faced the choice between accepting defeat and creating solutions that no one else had considered possible? These weren't abstract questions anymore. They were the realities I had lived through, the choices I had made, and the lessons I carried forward into a completely different understanding of what was possible when desperation met determination and conventional thinking met revolutionary problem-solving. The transformation that followed Maya's surgery extended far beyond her improved health and our family's relief. The unconventional financing arrangement I had negotiated became the foundation for a business model that I developed over the following months, helping other families navigate medical financing crises through creative investment structures that connected immediate healthcare needs with long-term economic opportunities. Within a year, I had helped 7 families secure funding for necessary medical procedures that their insurance companies had denied or delayed. The model worked because it created genuine value for investors while providing families with immediate access to life-saving care without traditional collateral requirements. But the most important outcome wasn't business development. It was the knowledge that systematic problems could be solved through individual innovation, that financial barriers to healthcare could be overcome through creative thinking and persistent effort, and that young people could create solutions that established institutions had failed to provide. Maya's recovery exceeded every medical prediction. 6 months after her surgery, she was playing soccer on her middle school team. 1 year later, she was running track and dreaming about high school athletics. 2 years later, she was volunteering at Children's Hospital, helping other families navigate the same healthcare system that had almost prevented her from receiving life-saving care. Her heart was fixed, but more importantly, I had learned that impossible was just another word for what no one had tried yet. The business that grew from my desperate attempt to save Maya's life became a regional healthcare financing company that specialized in connecting families facing medical crises with investors willing to bet on human potential rather than traditional collateral. We had helped over 200 families access necessary medical care, created a new model for healthcare financing that other entrepreneurs were beginning to replicate, and proved that individual innovation could address systematic failures in healthcare access. 3 years after Maya's surgery, I was invited to speak at the National Conference on Healthcare Innovation about alternative financing models for families facing medical emergencies. Standing at that podium, representing not just my own family's experience, but the experiences of hundreds of families whose medical crises had become catalysts for innovative solutions, I felt the weight of responsibility that comes with platforms that can influence policy and inspire action. 3 years ago, I began, my 12-year-old sister's life-saving heart surgery was canceled because our family couldn't provide a $23,000 upfront payment to the hospital. In 72 hours, I had to choose between accepting that my sister would die from a treatable condition or finding a way to create solutions that didn't exist in traditional healthcare financing. I shared research about the correlation between medical debt and delayed care, statistics about families who were forced to choose between necessary medical procedures and financial stability, and examples of innovative financing models that were emerging to address gaps in traditional healthcare payment systems. The most important lesson I learned, I explained, is that healthcare access problems require both individual solutions and systematic change. Families facing immediate medical crises need emergency alternatives to traditional financing, but sustainable healthcare security requires policies that treat medical care as a human right rather than a consumer commodity. I outlined models for community-based healthcare financing that connected immediate medical needs with long-term economic development, emphasizing the importance of creating win-win relationships between families needing care and investors willing to bet on human potential. Healthcare innovation isn't just about developing new medical technologies, I concluded. It's about developing new financial technologies that ensure everyone can access the medical care they need to live healthy, productive lives. My sister's heart surgery wasn't just a medical success. It was proof that creative financing can overcome systematic barriers when conventional approaches have failed. The standing ovation that followed wasn't just recognition of the presentation. It was acknowledgement that healthcare financing crises require both individual creativity and collective innovation. That families like mine weren't isolated cases, but examples of systematic problems that could be solved through sustained effort and policy reform. 4 years after that terrifying phone call that canceled Maya's surgery, I was invited to testify before a congressional subcommittee about innovative approaches to healthcare financing and the role that alternative investment models could play in ensuring access to necessary medical care. Representatives, I began. 4 years ago, I was an 18-year-old whose 12-year-old sister was going to die from a treatable heart condition because our family couldn't afford the upfront payment that the hospital required for her surgery. I presented research about the economic impact of delayed medical care, statistics about families who were forced into bankruptcy by medical expenses, and policy recommendations for supporting innovative financing models that could bridge gaps between medical necessity and financial accessibility. The question isn't whether we can afford to provide healthcare to everyone who needs it, I explained. The question is whether we can afford to continue forcing families to choose between medical care and financial survival when innovative solutions exist to ensure that both needs can be met simultaneously. I outlined proposals for federal support of healthcare financing innovation, tax incentives for investors who provided capital for medical procedures, and regulatory frameworks that could encourage development of alternative payment models while protecting families from exploitation. Healthcare financing reform isn't about charity or government spending, I concluded. It's about creating market-based solutions that generate value for investors while ensuring that medical care is accessible to families regardless of their current financial circumstances. My sister's heart surgery proved that such solutions are possible when we're willing to think beyond traditional approaches to healthcare payment. The committee received my testimony with the attention that healthcare innovation deserves, but the conversation that meant the most came afterward, when a representative approached me privately. "My nephew needs surgery that our family can't afford," she said. "After hearing your testimony, I want to learn more about the financing models you've developed. This isn't just policy for me, it's personal." That conversation reminded me that healthcare crises affect families across every demographic, that the solutions we had developed for Maya could work for other families facing similar challenges, and that systematic change happens through accumulation of individual innovations that prove better approaches are possible. 5 years after Maya's surgery, I graduated from State University with degrees in business administration and healthcare management, having completed my education while continuing to run the healthcare financing company that had grown from my desperate attempt to save my sister's life. But the moment that brought everything full circle came during my graduation ceremony, when Maya, now 17, healthy, and dreaming about college athletics, stood up in the audience and cheered loud enough for everyone to hear when my name was called. After the ceremony, we celebrated with a family dinner that included 42 people from our extended family and the network of families whose medical crises had become financial innovations. The same kitchen where we had once calculated whether Maya would live or die was now filled with stories of successful surgeries, recovered health, and young entrepreneurs who had learned that systematic problems could be solved through individual determination combined with creative thinking. The financing company had grown into a regional firm that employed 15 people, had facilitated medical care for over 500 families, and had inspired similar ventures in 12 other states. But the achievement I was most proud of wasn't business expansion. It was the knowledge that Maya's near-death experience had become the foundation for ensuring that other children would have access to life-saving care regardless of their family's financial circumstances. "What Marcus proved," Maya said during a toast at our celebration dinner, "is that sometimes the most shocking thing you can do is refuse to accept that someone you love has to die because they can't afford to live." He didn't just save my life. He saved hundreds of other lives by proving that there's always another way if you're willing to work hard enough to find it. 6 years after that desperate phone call that turned Maya's life into a financial transaction, I was invited to address the graduating class of the State University's business school. Standing at that podium, looking out at students who would spend their careers developing solutions to complex problems, I thought about the journey that had brought me from medical crisis to healthcare innovation, from family emergency to systematic change. 6 years ago, I told them, I received a phone call that taught me the difference between accepting problems and solving problems, between conventional thinking and revolutionary thinking, between what's normal and what's necessary. I talked about the importance of understanding that every business opportunity is ultimately about serving human needs, that the most successful innovations often emerge from personal experience with systematic failures, and that young entrepreneurs have advantages over established businesses when it comes to developing solutions that established institutions are unwilling or unable to create. Some of you will build businesses that generate wealth, I continued. Some of you will develop technologies that change industries. Some of you will create innovations that solve problems people didn't even know could be solved. I looked out at faces that represented the next generation of business leaders. People who would determine whether systematic problems continued to destroy families or became opportunities for innovative solutions. What I want you to remember, I concluded, is that the most shocking thing you can do isn't necessarily the most dramatic or attention-getting thing. Sometimes the most shocking thing you can do is refuse to let the people you love become statistics in other people's profit margins. Refuse to accept that systematic failures are permanent conditions, and refuse to believe that age or experience determines your ability to create solutions that no one else has tried. The applause was generous, but the moment that mattered most came afterward, when a student named David approached me with his younger sister, both of them with tears in their eyes. "My sister needs surgery that our insurance won't cover," he said. "Our family has been trying to figure out how to pay for it, and we were starting to think it might be impossible. After hearing your speech, I think there might be options we haven't considered." I looked at David and saw myself 6 years earlier, young, desperate, caught between family loyalty and financial impossibility, convinced that loving someone meant accepting defeat when conventional solutions had failed. There are always options you haven't considered, I told him. The question is whether you're ready to shock everyone, including yourself, by creating them. If you believe that healthcare is a human right rather than a financial privilege, that systematic problems can be solved through individual innovation, and that sometimes the most shocking thing you can do is refuse to accept unacceptable realities, then this story matters to you too. Subscribe for more stories about young people who refuse to let their family members become victims of systematic failures, who learned that revolutionary thinking can overcome institutional barriers, and who discovered that the most important question isn't whether you can afford solutions, but whether you can afford to stop looking for them. Because that phone call, turning Maya's life into a billing dispute, taught me something no classroom ever could. That some shocks are too devastating to accept, some systems are too broken to respect, and some people are too precious to let die, while you follow rules written by people who never had to choose between someone's life and someone's profit margin. Hit that subscribe button if you believe that surgery should save lives rather than generate revenue, that medical necessity should determine healthcare access rather than financial capacity, and that sometimes the most shocking thing you can do is prove that love can create solutions that institutions claim are impossible. Because sometimes the most shocking thing you can do is refuse to let the people you love become statistics in other people's profit margins. And sometimes the greatest gift you can give your sister isn't protection from the world's cruelty, but proof that the world's cruelty can be overcome by someone who loves her enough to shock everyone, including himself, by creating solutions that didn't exist until someone was desperate enough and determined enough to build them from scratch. Maya's heart beats normally now, strong and steady, pumping blood through chambers that work exactly as they were designed to work. But more than that, her heart beats as a symbol of what becomes possible when someone refuses to accept that love has limitations, that youth has boundaries, or that systematic failures are permanent conditions that families have to endure rather than problems that individuals can solve. The most shocking thing I ever did wasn't dramatic or violent or illegal. The most shocking thing I ever did was refuse to believe that my sister's life was worth less than the hospital's payment policies, refuse to accept that 18-year-olds can't solve problems that defeat adults, and refuse to let the healthcare system turn Maya's heart defect into our family's financial death sentence. Sometimes shock therapy isn't medical, it's moral. Sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is prove that the impossible is just another word for what no one has tried yet. And sometimes the greatest honor you can give the people you love is showing them that their lives are worth more than any system's limitations, more valuable than any institution's policies, and more important than any conventional wisdom about what young people can or cannot accomplish when everything depends on their success.